It's symbolic. I don't believe in coincidence that I'm here today, and this is the day when I become crowned as a Zulu boy, and that we value our identities, cultural identities. We value who we are as a people, and very importantly, we can only retain who we are and develop ourselves forward. And there's a condition that our languages, our indigenous African languages, are extremely important. They've been important, but evidence is coming clearer and clearer that they need to be part of the education system broadly. I'm going to speak about the language unit of the DBE and what has been happening around mother tongue-based bilingual education, what we did, project or research that look at the feasibility, the possibility and feasibility of using African languages for learning and teaching beyond grade 3. So what I have in here in the 25 minutes is going to be a marathon. I'll try to rush through my slides as quickly as I can. Here I have an executive summary, a summary of the executive summary in the report, which is an ongoing presentation. There's a need to use African languages as the media of learning and teaching beyond grade 3 and improve learning outcomes. That need has reached a sense of urgency. It's so urgent that the change has to happen. This is based on literature, as we all know, that you learn better in the language that you are familiar with. The policy framework that we have in the country allows for that, and we have done this empirical work in 9 provinces to validate that. The key finding, which should not be a surprise, that there's a desirability of learning through African languages beyond grade 3. Of course, the feasibility questions remain. We don't know if this will work, but we want it. But one of the questions that arise is, will the assessment support that? And that is a big question for this endeavor, Lekgotla. Using more than one language for learning and teaching is a common practice in public schools. And this is modeled in the Eastern Cape under the mother tongue-based bilingual education. Colleagues, we are using mother tongue here as a placeholder because, you know, it's a misnomer. It doesn't necessarily mean first language in all cases. Therefore, what is needed is a normalization of what is happening in the classroom, what you call trans-languaging, because that allows for maintenance of both languages, because that's what additive multilingualism is about, or gradual release of or delayed transition between African languages and English. And very importantly, and specifically for us here today, is alignment of multilingual learning and teaching with multilingual assessment. There's a need for minor revisions in the language policy, just explicitly stating some of these innovations that are coming. And of course, everything goes with money. Budget, long-term commitment is not a one-day project. There's a need, therefore, to retain, sustain language units in the provinces, the National Language Unit in the DBE to play an oversight, monitor and evaluate. I would like to just say a few things around language. Many people believe or think that when we speak about using languages for learning and teaching is a sentimental issue. It's really foundational in the sense that there are 2 things. The reason we put kids to school is that they come to know. And secondly, they become. In other words, the sense of who you are. And you need a language to access knowledge, as well as you need a language to become a better sense of who you are. The DBE sought to establish a language policy unit to comply with the provisions of both the Constitution and the Official Languages Act of 2012. In particular, the provisions would allow the department to develop language in education policy framework and ensure that each school adopts a language policy that operates within the prescripts of the Constitution, as well as other legislative frameworks that promote multilingualism. And very importantly, ensure that African languages are developed to the level of usage as languages of learning and teaching beyond grade 3. You'll see so far that there's maybe an obsession about moving beyond grade 3, and that is a very, very critical point that we'll illustrate later on. Why? What we did, we followed a framework of language policy and planning, implementational model, which I'm not going to spend time on, which was called status planning, corpus planning, development of materials, and that corpus might also mean development of assessment materials. Acquisition, or it will give direction to the type of assessments we need to produce. Acquisition planning, very importantly, prestige planning, that this is important, advocacy, given the history and of African languages in the country. We did what is called a rapid assessment. I'm not spending time on that, but we went to all 9 provinces in 2022, focusing on this question: can we move beyond grade 3? This is a methodology used just to show that we have engaged with literally everybody, all stakeholders that we needed to see. And then we use this type of methodologies, baseline, endline, interview schedules. I'm not going to the detailed document reviews as well. But when you came to the Eastern Cape, the model changed. We are using implementational effectiveness hybrid design. While they're implementing, we're also looking at how effective that is. So you can see from here that this was a much more detailed approach. So let me quickly run with some of the findings so that we can get to the assessment issue. There's no doubt at the national level that there's a need for learning and teaching through African languages beyond grade 3, because the current transition practice has no educational or linguistic basis to be sustained. In other words, it doesn't make educational sense that you learn through your mother tongue for 3 years and you change, or you make that transition in grade 4. Many educational experts know that this is where the challenge is. This is at about age 10 or 11. And this is sustained. The weaker are getting weaker in the system over time until they reach grade 12. We assess them there, but you can see that there's a lot of resuscitation programs in order to bring them up. It doesn't make linguistic sense either, because it takes about 6 years to learn your mother tongue to be called a mother tongue speaker of a language. In that same breath, it also takes about 6 years before we admit you in our grade 1, because there's a clear connection between language and cognitive development. So if you learned your mother tongue for 6 years, how can you learn through a language you learned only for 3 years, which is not your mother tongue? There's no justification for that. It doesn't make sense. This policy, if we also track it, it comes from the 1800s, the missionaries. It was meant to Christianize and not to educate. It was meant for adults. It was never meant for children. We sustained it, we retained it, and it's a common practice in our schools. 80% of our schools are using this. So that's why the urgency of getting rid of it, because it doesn't make political, economic, cultural, linguistic, educational sense. Basically, it makes no sense. We can't find any single justification why it should be retained. And because of that, the policy provisions are there that you can use any language, but there's a need for explicitness. Now we come to the big issue, finding number 2, around that many teachers that we spoke to in the country, they say that code switching is the only way to teach. In other words, I can't have my class and complete it only in one language, confirmed in all the 9 provinces. That means what is conceptually called translanguaging. Simultaneous use of languages for learning and teaching has become common, and it is common not only in the classrooms, but is common as a social practice in the media, in the soapies, everywhere. Is some kind of a competence that people have. Therefore, a clear recommendation from here is that you normalize translanguaging as the preferred method for learning and teaching, so that it moves from being organic to being pedagogical. And then in that breath, then you introduce bi- or multilingual assessment as a regime to align learning and teaching practices. In other words, our assessment now would mirror the actual teaching in the classroom, unlike what is happening at the moment. Stakeholders have confirmed that the transition to learning through medium of English is premature, and that it creates systemic challenges for the system, which are very difficult to address, to solve later in the years. In fact, that's why we have got a lot of camps with matric, no play, no church, no anything, and then we camp the kids so that they pass, but that's a real challenge, because then we put them to the lowest level of cognition, which is memorization. Okay. Therefore, there's a need to encourage schools explicitly to use African languages formally in grade 4 and beyond through translanguaging. In response to that transition, we have seen a number of schools also going backward. They want now to introduce English for learning and teaching from grade 1, which is uninformed. That is not supported by any practice. We can learn from the French, or what is called Francophone Africa, that had tried that, and in fact they're making the swing to the other way. The minimum threshold for schools where English is an additional language should be 6 years of mother tongue base, 6 years as a minimum. Before 6 years is premature. That means up until grade 6 as a minimum threshold. Number 5, we also know that some of the reasons why we kept this practice, which is not really a policy, is that there are myths that overrate the importance of English as the language of learning and teaching. And it's just misinformation that has been in the system for too long. English is an international language, no debate about that. It is a language of international communication, but it's not necessarily the language of international in learning and teaching through. What am I saying? It's not the international language of learning and teaching, but it is an international language of communication. So we make a distinction between learning a language versus learning through a language. There are myths again that underrate the importance of using one's familiar language, what you call mother tongue or home language, for learning, teaching, and assessing. For example, the borrowings and the dialects and the words that may not actually fit. And it's very important for the public to know that borrowing is common. That's the only way that a language can develop. Learning from English itself, that most of the words that are in English are coming from other languages. In fact, the scientific concepts, even the word virus is not English. 80% of the words are not necessarily English. Therefore, borrowing is normal as long as when you are borrowing the word, it has to meet the morphology of the target language. And that you have got many dialects in African languages, that's not unique to African languages. It's very common to all languages of the world. Diversity or differences doesn't mean deficiencies, but it's a power that is harnessed through what you might call synonyms and all of that if you standardize. So that's not potentially a problem. So you start from borrowing and then you do what is called neologism, developing new words after you have borrowed. Mother tongue-based bilingual, the schools that are applying this, they show that there's a high levels of understanding and confidence levels, which is the identity part, among the learners who are involved in the program. Therefore, there's a need for whole-scale support for mother tongue-based bilingual education, including assessments. The Eastern Cape provides a prototype, we can say that with confidence, for incremental use of African languages for learning, teaching, and assessing, because everybody else is doing what the Eastern Cape is doing informally, but what the Eastern Cape is doing, it has introduced assessment to the teaching, and that's the beauty side of that. So in fact, we just completed this, what we call deeper modeling exercise, where we went back to the Eastern Cape to learn more about the principles, methods, and process for the Eastern Cape, so that can be the showroom or a prototype that other provinces may follow. As colleagues sitting here, you might know that the trial exams have already shown you've got Sesotho and Isxhosa used, of course, but that's not translated into the actual final exams. That has happened in 6 subjects already. Now, the issue here, we have got an issue, and it's an issue that we need to confront, which is there is a monolingual bias, an epistemic bias in the current assessment protocols. What does that mean? It means our assessment policies and practices are based on monolingual constructs, where test takers are expected to demonstrate that their language proficiency in one language at the time. In other words, one language, one subject, or one learning area. The construct underlying these assessment approaches is not just South Africa, it is a global phenomenon. Or scales is of a language as closed and a finite system that does not enable other language to smuggle in. That's why teachers also feel they're smuggling languages when they code switch in their classrooms, because that's not permitted in the assessment. It's because of the constructs of it's rooted in oneness ideology that you need to have one language at the time. There's no way that languages can bleed into each other. We call linguistic apartheid. One nation, one language, one classroom, one language, one lesson, one language, one assessment, one language, no intersection. And all of that are getting outdated because they don't reflect the reality of creative multilingualism, or what you call multilingual competence. Issue number 2 is that multilingual knowledge becomes a liability, actually. Learners are penalized for multilingual competencies. That's almost striking their identity, that this part of you doesn't exist. And yet, languages, as we are saying, that they're actually doing the bleeding. If they don't bleed out on the paper, they are in their cognitive domains. They're already thinking in the languages, not what we see, but what is in their heads, because our assessments are not able to mirror that. It's come from an old tradition. I'm not going to read this about the one language because I've already mentioned that. The new way, I think the Council of Europe already in 2021 have shown or are speaking about, been speaking about this type of overlap where all linguistic abilities have got a place. Okay? Basque in Spain and Spanish, they're already doing work in this regard. So, quick questions. Why do we need multilingual assessment? I think my presentation already has done the justification. One, which is code switching is the most distinctive behavior of a multilingual speaker. And inclusion of African languages in assessment practices across the learning areas. It does offer options, so you can choose. Assessment, therefore, is linked to practices of teaching and learning. Then you've got the washback effect on learning and teaching. Because if you have got the assessment, then that will, many teachers and the learners would have the confidence. One of the issues about multilingual teaching, really the big story, international, is what about assessment? And the question this morning is, what about assessment? While issues of equity and social justice, of course, we do know that Afrikaans mother tongue speakers have got that ability to have Afrikaans and English, and yet there are many kids in this country that have got their languages too, but they never have to see that in their exams. If you ask me a question about multilingual assessment, is everything assessment as learning itself? Actually, we have seen this in some of the Eastern Cape classrooms where children are able to reflect in languages other than English what they have learned. An assessment for learning, okay, and of course assessment of learning. So there's nothing in the multilingual domain that is, I'll show in a second some of the opportunities. What they have done, one of the ones is that you have bilingual instructions. Here is in isiXhosa, although the answers, as you can see, are in English, so they still have, and they get them right. And you have got other cases where you have got bilingual instruction, and then you have got bilingual responses. In other words, they can choose, A might have Roman figure 1 and Roman figure 2, and then you can take the isiXhosa 1 or you can take the English version. That's your choice. And then they understand ecosystem. There's nothing untoward about that. Here is an option where the answers are in, you have got an English answer and slash an isiXhosa answer, so you can choose. Okay? It is happening. There are more, so you can actually get more complicated than that, where you have got an input in more than one language, output in one language, depending on what is preferred by the school. The implication is that you need to have standard equivalent answers in more than one language. That's the implication for the assessment ecosystem. The most well-known one, which is used elsewhere, is the side-by-side examinations, where it's just an exam that is in two languages and there's no bleeding between the languages. One question paper from page 1 to 4 in one language, and then just clearly a repeat where you can flip to that question if you don't understand, and depending on if examiners are ready, whichever language that is chosen. But the key issue here is then you have got more valid constructs in that way because they mirror the actual teaching. And when we are sitting, this is the real big elephant in the room, because if the language in education policy is to be multilingual, assessment is a key player. And in fact, it becomes a quick win because we say teachers are already doing this, but teachers are not necessarily assessing multilingual except in the Eastern Cape. And therefore, if that happens, now the overall recommendation you'd have is a trans-languaging approach. It's not about what languages look like, but what the learners do with the languages. It mirrors the multilingual focus of looking at learner as a multilingual person who uses resources from their whole multilingual repertoire It valorizes the idea that learners' use of the multilingual resources is accepted and mixing languages is a legitimate act that does not result in penalties, but rather is an effective means of expressing and communicating ideas that otherwise cannot be transmitted in one language. If teaching is going in the direction, and we know it does, assessment should follow the same path. Concluding again to remind ourselves that code switching, or what we refer to as translanguaging, is a common in our school. Also to say that assessment protocols may be charged with being epistemically or monolingually biased, the construct favoring more of a monolingual child rather than a child who has got multilingual competence. There's a need, therefore, for multilingual or translanguaging approach in order for this alignment, and what is needed is more feasibility studies to choose models that might work. They may even differ from province to province, but the common thread is it is a multilingual assessment. Thank you.